Okay, so thanks a lot for inviting me to discuss this very interesting and thought-provoking paper by Pablo, Diego, and Paolo. Okay, so the idea is pretty simple, right? So it's a very well understood result that when prices enter borrowing constraints, the competitive equilibrium is constraint inefficient, right? Meaning that a social planner that cares about the utility of the households and faces the same technological constraints as the households, but is able to, say, pick the allocation, would actually choose a different allocation from the laissez-faire equilibrium, right? And this is very, like, a very influential motive to have like macroprudential policies and active capital controls in our international macro context. Now, what this paper is saying is, okay, not so fast. There's like which prices enter the constraints, meaning either it's current or future prices, is crucial for the argument. And what they say is, okay, in a large class of models, I'm going to talk a bit more about this. Intervention is actually not desirable if two conditions hold, like only future prices enter the borrowing constraint, and second, the planner lacks condition. Okay, so what I'll do here is, okay, I read the paper, and then it's like, okay, I had a similar reaction to, I think, like what Enrique was asking in the chat, like what exactly is going on? Let me try to like build the easiest model I can and try to build some intuition for the result in what sense it's general. And also something that I think was like, it's interesting to discuss more is the role of commitment, like what actual role is playing this lack of commitment. Okay, so let me build a different, like a similar model, but simplified. Okay, so just 3 periods, 0, 1, 2. There's uncertainty that is realized at a state in period 1, right? And there's no further shocks at t equals 2. Standard preferences, additively separable. There's a single good. So, and then it's a borrowing constraint at t equals 1. Okay, so like it's like I'm imagining that there's doesn't bind in period, well, 2 there's not, this doesn't make sense, but in period 0 it doesn't bind. Of course, it's the same thing. And then it's basically, okay, then let me consider 2 versions, right? In one case, how much I can borrow between period 1 and 2 depends on my consumption in period 1. And in the other case, it depends on my consumption in period 2. Okay, and this is like a reduced form formulation of the same model, right? You can imagine that C is actually something like dollar spending, and dollar spending is tied via an equilibrium condition to the consumption of non-tradables, and consumption of non-tradables influences the price of non-tradables, the price of non-tradables influences the borrowing constraint. At the end of the day, what you have a link between something like spending or consumption, something we decide over time, and the borrowing constraint, right? So we just need a GE link, right? It's clear that you could like complicate this model in many directions, put labor, put many goods. At the end of the day, this is all that matters. Okay, so what is the problem with current income? Well, you just maximize, the utility of the household, and then you have the budget constraints as usual. You just have some like process, say, for the endowment, and then you have the borrowing constraint, right, which is like contemporary. And this is pretty simple. We teach it to our students when we teach, I guess, Javier's paper or like Enrique's paper, right? So we just have the first order condition for consumption is like, well, marginal utility, but there's also the effect that, oh, I'm relaxing the borrowing constraint, right? So we have this mu. Now it's clear from here that, okay, if the constraint binds in the state S, right, the marginal value of a unit of consumption, lambda, is above the private value of a unit of consumption, u prime, right? And since in period 0 there is no problem, right? The social value on the private value coincide here. So essentially, when you look at this Euler equation here, right, you basically say, okay, agents are over borrowing at equal 0, right? And this is a time consistent problem, right? If I say, okay, the planner reoptimizes at period 1 or period 2, you get the same solution. Okay, so what's the problem with future income? Here's what I think like Enrique was hinting in the chat, right? Okay, what's the problem with future income? Okay, now here in the constraint, CT plus 1 appears. Okay, so the consumption in period 2. So if I look, the first conditions are similar, except that now instead of having, a multiplier with the subindex t, right? I have it a multiplier with subindex t minus 1. Why? Because consuming in period 2 does not affect the borrowing constraint in period 2. It affects the borrowing constraint in period t minus 1. Okay, but what does this imply? Okay, let's evaluate this first order condition in period 0 and period 1. Well, in period 0 is meaningless because there's no borrowing constraint in minus 1. In period 1, it affects the borrowing constraint at 0, which basically you can say it doesn't bind, or here I don't even have it, so it's also 0. So now you see that both in period 0 and in period 1, the social marginal value of a unit of consumption is equal to the private marginal value of a unit of okay, so what I was going to say is, okay, mu t minus 1 is the one that appears here, right? So it's clear that the decision between 0 and 1 is okay. Then, but in a crisis, you know, the borrowing constraint binds, so the planner cannot do anything between 1 and 2, which I think is what Enrique was hinting in the comment, right? So what they are saying when they claim that when Diego and authors say, okay, there's a one-to-one mapping, what they're saying is, okay, the planner may disagree on how much it is hurt by the borrowing constraint, right? But it doesn't matter because it cannot do anything about it, right? Now, one thing that you can see is, okay, is it constraint efficient? And here, like, it's a bit of semantics, right? But suppose we had the fourth period, right? And when you see, okay, it doesn't really matter for 0, 1. I didn't like actually use how many periods there were after the crisis, right? So it's still the case that I don't want to tax between 0 and 1. So I think like one of the core ideas of the paper has nothing to do with like lack of commitment, okay? One of the core ideas of the paper is there's this literature that tells me, oh, I should be super worried about credit books and I should curve, you know, this borrowing, right? And this is, it doesn't matter whether you have commitment or not. It's exactly what Enrique was saying, right? I cannot do anything about what's happening within the period of the borrowing constraint bind because it depends on all things in the future, right? So why would I ever, like, given that I'm going to borrow this much in that period, why would I ever distort the decisions between 0 and 1? Okay, so I think that's like my intuition, right? So then there's like something I don't have a lot of time to discuss, but if you think without commitment, okay, with commitment, there's actually stuff you can do, right? Because you can say, okay, but if I care about income in period 2 after the crisis, 1 period after the crisis, more than I care for the constraint about period 3 after the crisis, then I can promise to redistribute consumption between 2 and 3 to affect 1, right? But of course, these are all promises, so the planner reoptimizes at equals 2. And he will say, oh, whatever, I don't like it, I want to smooth consumption, right? So if you solve it by backwards induction, you see that with lack of commitment, you don't want to do anything after the crisis, so you don't want to do anything before or after the crisis, right? Okay. So yeah, so that's what I was saying here. That's I think what they mean by that fact that the laissez-faire is constraint efficient. It's not constraint efficient, I think, in the far-reverting sense, right, where the planner can dictate everything, right, and there's full commitment because he will still like to like reshuffle consumptions in the future if that affects the borrowing constraint today. But you know, if you solve backwards induction, these promises are completely time inconsistent. So at the end of the day, you cannot do it. Okay. Okay. So what do we make of this? So here is part where it's tricky, right? Because it's always easy as applied theory. Say, okay, the empirical people should figure out whether it's like current or future income, right? But then it's like, okay, in the model, it's like, it's very clear, but what does it mean in reality, right? And then it's like, okay, but the model is very stylized. Suppose I split it in half. Well, then, you know, like things that were before current income are now going to be future income. And because of this reserve property, right, that I cannot do anything about the future, well, this means that now I want to intervene less and less and less and less as I split and split and split more. Now, clearly, this is not the answer, I think. It's just that, you know, we have to think more carefully about how we can write a model that, you know, as we like change the definition of the time period still makes sense, right? Like, I don't know the answer to this, but like maybe thinking about things like the maturity or, you know, trying to like think about, well, what could like actually smooth a bit this reset property of the model or technological linkages with future periods, etc. Okay, I tried to finish in 3 minutes, but maybe at the cost of like being understandable.